For nearly 30 years, the quiet rural community around North Pond, Maine, was consumed by an eerie mystery that left even the police baffled. Scattered with seasonal cabins, this beautiful area turned unsettling every single spring as cabin owners returned after long, harsh winters to find their homes violated. Fridges were empty, food had vanished, and essential supplies had mysteriously disappeared, leaving behind a trail of confusion and fear around the pond. Batteries had been stripped from flashlights, clothing had been taken from drawers, and propane tanks had been snatched from grills. But oddly enough, valuable items like TVs and jewelry, well, those items were never touched. There were no broken windows, and there were no busted locks. Whoever was responsible for all these robberies had slipped in and out like a ghost, leaving no trace behind. Whoever or whatever was doing this was methodical, careful, and basically impossible to catch. Residents were left to wonder if they were being watched, their homes silently invaded by an unseen presence. Whispers of a shadowy figure spread throughout the town, but nobody ever caught a glimpse. No one ever saw him. Speculation ran wild throughout North Pond. Some people blamed teenagers, other people suspected a cunning neighbor might be responsible, and many people began to doubt their own memory, thinking that they had just simply misplaced the missing items. But as the years stretched on and these mysterious break-ins continued, a chilling realization began to sink in. Someone had been living among the residents of North Pond, hiding in the wilderness, silently preying on their cabins, basically using them as his own personal Walmart. For nearly 3 decades, nobody knew his name, or where he came from for that matter, until one day, everything changed. This is the unbelievable story of a man nicknamed the North Pond Hermit. Folks, this is one of the most unique stories that I've ever covered, hands down, and it raises a very interesting moral question that I'd like your feedback on once you're done watching this video. I kind of have a feeling that a lot of you are going to be divided on this, so make sure you watch the entire story, and then once you do, please leave your respectful comments down below. One of my viewers from Maine actually suggested this story to me, so whoever you are, thank you very much. And with that said, I'd like to invite you on a virtual trip to that very state, a state that I know very, very well, the great state of Maine. This virtual trip is totally free, but you must hit that subscribe button to cover your admission and to also help us reach our ambitious goal of hitting 1 million subscribers. We're getting up there, folks, and so please hit that subscribe button, especially if you're a repeat viewer. And okay, let's do it. To start this story off, I want to introduce you to a very peculiar man named Christopher Knight. Christopher and his 5 siblings grew up in the small town of Albion, Maine, and to be honest with you, there isn't really much known about his upbringing, but from what I gathered, there certainly wasn't any red flags or indicators that something was wrong. Christopher was apparently a really good student, so good in fact that he even ended up graduating high school early. Everything pretty much seemed normal. I mean, the only even slightly negative aspect of his upbringing that stood out to me is that he apparently had a difficult time making friends, which you could maybe take that as a bit of a yellow flag, but it's not exactly uncommon for people in high school either. Now, folks, I've spent a lot of time in Maine. I have a bunch of friends there. My mother was born and raised in Aroostook County. And most importantly, I've seen every single episode of Northwood's Law, so I can tell you very confidently that the great outdoors, they're just a way of life in Maine. And this was certainly true for Christopher Knight and the rest of his family. He spent time hunting with his father, and he was comfortable in the woods. I mean, almost everybody in rural Maine is. And yet, despite being so familiar with the wild, something curious stands out about his early days. Christopher never spent a single night in a tent. He never camped alone, And for a boy that was raised in the deep woods of Maine, this fact seems oddly out of place, especially when you consider the events that would occur later in his life. After graduating high school, Christopher Knight went to technical school in Waltham, Massachusetts, and shortly thereafter, he landed a job in that very same area installing security alarm systems, which is quite ironic, I have to say, for reasons that you'll understand very shortly. He worked in Massachusetts for some time, but then, on a otherwise unremarkable day in 1986, something in him changed. Without warning, Christopher Knight abandoned everything. His job, his life in Massachusetts. He got in his car and he just started driving north all the way back to Maine. He drove through his hometown of Albion, past familiar roads and faces, but he didn't stop there. He kept driving deeper and deeper into the wilderness, down dirt roads as far as his car would take him. And then, when the gas gauge hit empty while he was on a remote, unmarked road, he parked his car, he grabbed a backpack, and he simply just walked into the woods. I'm not sure how long he was planning on staying in the woods. To be honest with you, I don't think he knew either. But as fate would have it, when Christopher Knight stepped into those woods, it would be 27 years before he'd step out of them and spend another night inside. And so with that said, you probably have some questions about all of that stuff, like how is he going to survive the harsh Maine winters? How is he going to feed himself? And probably most obvious, why the hell did he do this? And folks, I'm going to answer all of those questions and more. But first, something that Christopher probably could have used while he was hiking around in the mountains was some Drink Element. Drink Element is the sponsor of this video, and I say that Christopher could have used some Element because I'm sure while he was hiking around, wandering around in the woods, he was probably sweating a lot. And here's the thing, folks, when you're doing something like that, when you're exercising, doing anything that makes you sweat, it's really not enough just to drink a lot of water. You need to replace the electrolytes that you sweat out, because if you don't, you're gonna get muscle cramps, you're gonna get fatigue. These are all things that I've experienced when I don't replace my electrolytes properly. And, you know, you could go into Walmart or whatever. I pick on Walmart a lot, but you could just go into the store and just grab whatever crap they have on the shelves, whatever electrolytes they have. But you don't want to do that. You want to get Drink Element, and here's why. First of all, Drink Element does not have any crap in it. It doesn't have any sugar. All it has is the electrolytes that you need to stay safe and hydrated. And speaking of the second point I was going to bring up, it also has a great taste. I'm not sure if I can get them to focus. Come on, camera. It's not going to work, but these are my two favorite flavors of Element right here. We have citrus salt and we have grapefruit salt, and these are literally just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to their flavors. They have other flavors like orange salt, and they even have these like creative out of the box flavors like mango chili or chocolate salt. The flavors and taste of Drink Element is probably the best thing about them, and you really can't get the full Element experience without trying all of their flavors. And so here is how you can do that. Go to drinkelement.com/KyleHatesHiking. That's drinkelement.com/KyleHatesHiking. You can click the link right at the top of the description as well. You're going to want to make a purchase of whatever flavor sounds best to you. Again, I would recommend citrus or grapefruit salt. And then when you do that through my link, you're going to get a sample pack of 8 additional flavors thrown in with your order for no extra cost. So you're going to get to try them all. And again, that's something you really want to do. You really want to get the full Element experience, folks. So one more time, drinklmnt.com/KyleHatesHiking. Go get your sample pack. Click the link at the top of the description. And folks, let's get back to the story. When Christopher Knight first set off into the woods, he was near Moosehead Lake, which is the largest lake in Maine. Folks, there he was, completely alone, with no plan, hardly any experience, and no idea what was going to happen next, which is a very incredible realization to come to. I mean, think about this. All of a sudden, this kid who had never spent the night in a tent was all alone by himself, wandering through the remote Maine forest, again, with no idea what he was going to do, no plan at all. This reality obviously hit him very hard. I mean, he had super limited supplies in his backpack, and more than anything, what he needed was food. At first, he survived by essentially just scavenging, even resorting to eating roadkill at times just to keep himself going. I mean, he was truly desperate. He would take advantage of any food source that he could find, but it didn't take long for him to realize that scavenging just wasn't gonna cut it. One day, while he was wandering through the woods, he came upon the garden of a remote, unoccupied cabin. And folks, just like that, fresh vegetables were sitting there right in front of his face. Now, he knew it was wrong to steal, but the hunger that was gnawing at him was stronger than his guilt. And so he filled up his backpack with as much as he could carry, and then he slipped silently back into the forest. Now, it might not have seemed like much, and it might not have seemed like a big deal, but this small act of desperation seemed to unlock something within Christopher. And so what started as a single benign theft would quickly transform into his key to survival. It was the easiest and the most effective way to feed, clothe, and protect himself. Over the next few years, Christopher Knight would transform into an expert thief, stealthily breaking into unoccupied cabins, usually in the early morning hours, raiding the fridge, the pantry, and the closets, and then getting out as quickly as he possibly could. Though these thefts allowed Christopher to continue his life in the wilderness, deep down, he always knew that it was wrong. He was careful to avoid people during his heists, and he never even considered confronting someone violently. In fact, he never even carried a firearm, which is something you think someone in the woods would actually be carrying. Christopher wasn't a criminal in the usual sense. He simply wanted to just continue to survive in his secluded world. These thefts, these raids, these heists, they quietly ate away at him, and yet he continued to do them, knowing that if he slipped up just one time, it would absolutely shatter his new life of solitude, and of course, it would likely land him behind bars. Christopher Knight's family was concerned after he disappeared, even to the point where they hired a private investigator to try and track him down. But with that said, I don't know why this is, but they never reported him missing to the police. And thus, for the first 2 years, he slowly moved his way south through the Maine woods and remained completely undetected. But then, one random day, he stumbled into the Belgrade Lakes area, which is near the town of Rome, Maine. He set up his usual campsite, except this time, he never left. The campsite that he chose was surrounded by thick woods and large boulders, which allowed him to remain completely out of sight and to stay hidden. Due to these factors, and due to the plethora of cabins nearby, Christopher Knight decided that this campsite would become his permanent home. He didn't know it at the time. He carried no map or compass with him, but this chosen campsite was less than 30 miles away from where he had grown up in Albion. It was also very close to the shores of North Pond. And so after settling down near the pond, Christopher stepped up his burglary skills to a whole new level. He began to spy on the residents of nearby cabins, silently studying their routines. He knew when they arrived, he knew when they left, and he also knew how long they would be gone for. He would meticulously plan his break-ins, only moving at night, usually during the middle of the week when less people were around. He got so sophisticated with this that he would even use the weather as his ally, opting to strike during heavy rain, knowing that the sound of the downpouring would mask his movements. He was careful to avoid roads and trails, and he was also intentional about avoiding any patterns or routines. He would always shave his face and put on his cleanest clothes before he headed out to do a raid, so that if someone did spot him, he wouldn't look like just some crazed man living in the woods. He did not want to appear like some wild man in rags. He wanted to appear as ordinary as possible. His skills became so refined that he would steal discarded canoes from the lakeside homes, and then he would paddle silently across the water under the cover of darkness. I mean, this is just insane, and it's very bold. Stealing canoes in order to help steal other items. I mean, using these canoes actually allowed him to haul more supplies than he could just simply carry on foot, so he would fill up the canoes and this made his nighttime raids even more effective. But something that's important to note here is that after he was done using the canoe to restock his supplies, Christopher would always return it. Part of this was to avoid detection, of course. I mean, he knew that a missing canoe would raise suspicions and it would likely be reported to the police. But there was also something deeper at play here. Christopher was a thief. I mean, there's no denying that. And yet, he seemed to commit his crimes with this odd sense of respect for his victims, if that makes sense. I mean, it probably doesn't. It sounds very strange, but he really tried to minimize the impact of his break-ins as much as possible. He stole, of course, but he wasn't out to destroy or to vandalize. He never trashed the cabins that he raided. He avoided breaking doors or windows whenever possible, and on the rare occasion that he did, he made a genuine effort to repair the damage. Once again, his raids were always unarmed, and violence was never an option. In fact, he went out of his way to be invisible, both in his actions and in his presence. One of the most telling moments of this came when he stole a mattress from one of the nearby cabins. Instead of breaking the door down in order to move the mattress out, he chose to enter through a window. He then carefully removed the door from its hinges, hauled the mattress outside, and then reassembled the door just as he had found it. Christopher Knight stole this mattress because once he had settled into his permanent camp, he was determined to strike the perfect balance between stealth and comfort. Food was always the biggest prize of his raids, but over time, things like clothing, cooking supplies, even books were also focused on. And yet, second to only food, one thing was essential above all else. That was propane. Propane tanks became one of the most frequently stolen items from the cabins around North Pond. With propane, Christopher Knight could cook his food, he could purify his water, and he could keep himself warm during Maine's brutal winters, which year after year, by the way, proved to be his biggest challenge to survival. Now, if you've never been to Maine before, let me tell you, the winters are extremely harsh, and they're also a very important part of Christopher Knight's story. I think it's very easy to romanticize what he was doing, you know, this guy that leaves society behind to go live amongst nature. Hell, I've probably even done some of this romanticizing in this video, but regardless of the romance, the charm of what Christopher Knight was doing completely wore off by, say, early December. Winter never got easier for Christopher. In fact, with each passing year, as he got older and older, winter became more and more deadly. On multiple occasions, he nearly died because of these brutal temperatures and brutal winter conditions, and this left him with no choice but to adapt. He had to do this if he was going to stay out there in the woods, and thus, after a few years, Christopher became as meticulous with his winter survival strategy as he was with his burglary strategy. Many of the cabins around North Pond were only occupied during the summer, and as the residents packed up and left each fall, Christopher Knight saw this as his golden opportunity. With the area deserted, he ramped up his raids, stealing food, propane, and other crucial supplies. As I said, winter in Maine is just straight up unforgiving. And Christopher Knight knew that once the deep cold set in, moving around too much would be risky. He might leave footprints, and it also just takes a lot more effort when it's freezing cold outside. And so every single fall would turn into a frantic race to gather enough provisions to survive the long, brutal months ahead. Christopher also used the fall, I'm just gonna be blunt here, he used the fall as the time to get fat. Just like the bears that he would occasionally spot in the woods, he used this time to bulk himself up. He would stuff himself with as much stolen food as he could get his hands on. Gaining weight wasn't just preparation for him, it was a matter of life and death. During the fall, he would also take the time to grow out his beard to the perfect length, which was long enough to protect his face from the biting wind, but short enough to avoid frostbite from ice building up on his beard. Now, It goes without saying that the biggest asset to his survival would have been his ability to make fire, but he actually never did this. He completely avoided making fires because he didn't want anyone to notice the flames through the woods. One of the most fascinating winter strategies that Christopher employed was actually his sleeping schedule. He would fall asleep very early in the evening, and then he would get up at 2 a.m. and start melting snow for his drinking water. The reason that he did this is because he was afraid that if he fell asleep for too long in the cold, well, he might not wake up at all. Christopher Knight survived 27 brutal Maine winters, and after 27 years of perfecting this routine, he basically had winter survival down to a science. But after nearly 3 decades of stealing from the cabins around North Pond, the residents and the police, well, they were starting to catch on to Christopher. His raids, which were once undetectable, were now becoming this undeniable pattern, and the quiet community that he preyed upon was beginning to piece together the mystery. As the years passed, the residents of North Pond began to come together with all of these stories of food, flashlights, propane, and even mattresses vanishing from their cabins without a trace. Nobody knew who was responsible, but eventually the residents began coining various nicknames for this unknown intruder. Some people called him the Mountain Man, other people called him the Hungry Man because he would steal so much food, but one name stuck out above all the rest, and that name was the North Pond Hermit. Even though nobody ever saw this man, I want to make it clear that his cabin raids wreaked havoc on the small community. It left residents extremely uneasy, especially because it had just gone on for so long. And I actually think that this very long quote from one of the residents really sums up the fear that Christopher had caused. Quote, "Unless you've experienced the 27 years of looking over your shoulder while walking around your camp at night and during the day, arriving at camp to find food, batteries, books, watches, etc. stolen, feeling that you're being watched constantly, feeling violated from someone breaking into your camp and going through your personal things, eventually questioning whether it's your neighbors who are guilty of these crimes, and also having to spend thousands of dollars on repairs and materials just trying to barricade your camp to make it break-in proof, you really, I don't think, have an idea of the magnitude of the impact this experience has had on all of our lives." Residents, the police, and the Maine Warden Service all began to work tirelessly to catch this unknown intruder, and for years and years, he was able to evade them until, in 2001, the residents of North Pond finally got their first glimpse at the Hermit. A wise resident had hidden a motion-sensing camera in his cabin, and one night, it snapped this photo right here. This photo shows a man bent over going through the refrigerator. But folks, this was not your typical midnight snack attack. This was the very first time that Christopher Knight was captured on camera during one of his raids. Oh, and by the way, it wouldn't be the last time either, but we're gonna get there. Despite this huge break in the case, and despite this photo being circulated all over Maine, another 10 years of raids and burglary went by before anybody caught another glimpse of the North Pond Hermit. 10 years. I mean, that's so much time if you think about it. Residents of North Pond came and went. Children who had grown up spending summers at the pond went off to college, and each year brought more frustration for the police, who were working overtime hunting the hermit, but always came up empty-handed. The North Pond Hermit's legend only deepened as he continued to evade capture year after year after year. But then, in 2013, everything changed. In a sudden twist, the case that had gripped North Pond for decades was blown wide open, unraveling the mystery that had kept the community on edge for so damn long. In April of 2012, the Hermit was once again captured on a security camera, this time in much higher resolution. And then, a few months later, when a resident was allegedly sleeping. The hermit broke in and the resident yelled at him and then he ran away. And although these two men never actually saw each other, it was yet another example of the hermit's cover nearly being blown. And finally, on April 4th, 2013, Christopher Knight broke into the Pine Tree Camp, which is this summer camp that he had frequently, perhaps a little too frequently, targeted before. By this point, Sergeant Terry Hughes of the Maine Warden Service had made it his personal mission to catch the hermit. He had studied the North Pond Hermit's patterns, patiently waiting for the moment when he would slip up. Christopher Knight had been very careful, obviously, but Sergeant Hughes was absolutely relentless. He knew that the hermit would return to Pine Tree Camp, which Christopher Knight had basically been treating like his personal Walmart for years and years and years. So Sergeant Hughes was determined to catch him, and unlike previous residents who had captured the hermit's image, Sergeant Hughes went a step further and actually installed a full-blown motion detection system that would trigger an alarm in his home, which was located literally just a mile away from the Pine Tree Camp. Every single night, this determined warden went to bed waiting for that moment where the alarm would sound, and on the night of April 4th, it finally did. Sergeant Hughes heard the alarm. He knew this was his chance, and so he jumped in his truck and he sped towards Pine Tree Camp. He gets there, he gets out of his truck, and he moved swiftly, cutting off the hermit's escape route, his flashlight slicing through the darkness. His flashlight beam landed right on Christopher Knight's face, this man who had eluded capture for so long, and with his pistol trained on the hermit, Sergeant Hughes had finally caught him completely red-handed. I mean, Christopher Knight's pockets were still stuffed with stolen food. His hands were still gripping supplies from this raid in progress. In this fateful moment, the legendary North Pond Hermit stood completely exposed, his secret life unraveling in the cold night air. He didn't fight. He didn't run. He just simply surrendered, offering only a few quiet words. After 27 years of isolation and shadowy survival, the North Pond Hermit's time in the woods had come to a silent yet inevitable end. Christopher Knight spent the next 7 months behind bars, which is a very stark and agonizing contrast to the solitude of the woods that he had called home for 27 years. The isolation of a jail cell was absolutely suffocating for a man who had spent so long in silence, alone with nature. Christopher Knight barely spoke during his time in jail. I mean, so many years had passed without him ever talking to another human that he had almost forgotten how to talk in the first place. The only reason that we even know about his time in jail, and the details of his 27 years in the woods for that matter, is because one persistent and friendly journalist was able to break through his wall of silence. A man named Michael Finkel, a journalist who was intrigued by the hermit's story, began writing letters to Christopher Knight and eventually visited him at the Kennebec County Jail. For reasons that are only known to Knight himself, he chose to open up to Finkel. Through these rare moments of communication, Finkel pieced together the extraordinary tale of Christopher Knight's life in the woods. And the results of their conversations became a series of articles and then later a book, which is called The Stranger in the Woods. And I'll have this book linked in the description if you want an even greater deep dive into this story. By the time Christopher Knight was sentenced, he was basically just sentenced to time served. He had spent 7 months in jail, and he was also ordered to pay $2,000 to the victims of his burglaries. He was ordered to complete a 17-month specialty court program. He was ordered to stay away from drugs and alcohol, and then he was released on probation, which lasted for 3 years. One of the most astonishing aspects of this, incredibly astonishing story is that it's estimated that Christopher Knight committed more than 1,000 burglaries over the years, which is something that he expressed immense guilt over, while he was confiding to Finkel and during his court hearings. Now, there's an elephant in the room when it comes to this story, a question that I'm sure many of you have been wondering about since basically the start of this video. This question is, why? Why did Christopher Knight suddenly abandon society, vanish into the wilderness, and endure brutal winter after brutal winter all alone in the woods? I wish that Christopher Knight had given a good answer to this question. I wish that there was an obvious reason behind why he did what he did, but the truth is, we still don't really know why. Hell, it seems like even he doesn't know why he did it. Maybe it was supposed to only be like a temporary thing, and then all of the guilt from the break-ins caused him to just retreat further away from society. That's just my speculation. Maybe he stayed in the woods for so long that he began to fear returning to a world that he no longer recognized. Or maybe he was just a lost soul, and there really is no true reason for what he did. The only thing even close to an explanation that I was able to find was that in the woods, Christopher Knight found contentment. The legacy of the North Pond Hermit remains very divisive. In fact, I'd be willing to bet that many of you will find yourself on different sides of this story. And it's because of this, at the beginning of the video, I asked for your feedback. And so now we're there. This is where I'd appreciate your comments, all of your feedback, your respectful opinions about Christopher Knight. On one hand, there's something that's undeniably romantic about the life that Christopher Knight led. This idea of retreating into nature and embracing complete solitude. I mean, this is a fantasy that many of us have entertained, even if for only, some fleeting moments. For most people, I mean, that's exactly what it is. It's a daydream, essentially. But Christopher Knight didn't just dream it, he actually lived it. And while he was most certainly a thief, he was never violent, and there's something in his unwavering dedication to solitude that's almost worthy of respect. But on the other hand, he was a criminal. I mean, he openly admitted this, he pled guilty, and he carried the weight of guilt for all of his raids and burglaries for all 27 years that he was in the woods. And even though he was never violent, he still terrorized the community around North Pond. He was never spotted, but his presence was certainly felt, leaving residents, families, even children extremely uneasy. His crimes, stealing from hardworking people who valued their property, were not without consequence. For those who lived near North Pond, Christopher Knight's actions weren't just unsettling, they were infuriating. If I lived near North Pond during all of this, I would have been straight up pissed off, to be frank. And so I can understand where both his critics and his supporters are coming from. So let me know what you think. And again, please leave your comments respectful. If you're too colorful in your language, YouTube is just going to automatically ban your comments anyways. And yeah, just let me know what you think about the story of the North Pond Hermit. YouTube seems to think that you'd enjoy watching this video next. And so folks, give it a click. And thank you so much for watching this video. I have the best subscribers on YouTube. I appreciate all of you so much. And I'll see you next week.